The pen scratched a whisper against the paper, a sound no louder than a mouse's breath. But to Prudence Bellamy, it was a declaration of war. In the small, worn ledger, under the column titled Debts Owed to P. Bellamy, she inscribed the date, the amount, 2 guineas, and the reason, for Louisa's dancing slippers. Beside it, in the lender column, she wrote the single damning name, Aunt Ingram. The ink was a cheap, watery brown, but the entry felt as though it were carved in stone. This was the 10th such entry in as many months. The ledger was her only secret, her only solace, the one place in the world where the truth was recorded without varnish or excuse. It was a meticulous accounting of her own diminishment. Prudence was 26 years old, and her life had been reduced to a series of such ledgers. Since the death of her parents 10 years prior, she had lived in the house of her aunt, Mrs. Ingram, in the tidy town of Marley. She was not a daughter, nor a guest, nor even precisely a poor relation. She was an asset, an unpaid, unacknowledged, and indispensable clerk, bookkeeper, and household manager. Her small inheritance, meant to provide for her future, was managed by her aunt and had become a communal fund from which her cousin Louisa's fancies were supplied and the household's embarrassing little debts were quietly paid. Prudence's meticulous record-keeping was the very skill used to exploit her. She kept the official books that presented a respectable face to the world, and this secret one that told the grim truth. She blotted the page carefully, the motion precise and economical. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Grief was an indulgence, like silk ribbons or extra sugar in one's tea, and she could afford neither. What she had instead was competence. It was a hard, cold comfort, but it was hers. While her cousin Louisa practiced the pianoforte and sketched watercolors, Prudence ensured the butcher was not overcharging, the cook was not pilfering the sherry, and the invitations to Mrs. Ingram's precarious social evenings were sent and accounted for. She was the invisible scaffolding holding up the crumbling facade of the Ingram family's respectability. "Prudence, are you mooning over those dreadful figures again?" Mrs. Ingram's voice, laced with a familiar, cloying sweetness that always preceded a demand, drifted down the hallway. "Mr. Severn is here. He wishes to see the charity accounts." Prudence's fingers tightened on her pen. The Marley Women's Relief Fund. Her aunt was the chairwoman, a title she wore like a jeweled brooch. But Prudence was its engine. She managed the donations, tracked the expenditures, and wrote the annual reports that her aunt would read aloud, stumbling over the larger words. Mr. Gideon Severn was the charity's chief benefactor, a man whose name was spoken in Marley with a mixture of awe and fear. A widower, fabulously wealthy, he owned the vast, brooding estate of Kestrel Chase just outside of town. He was known to be ruthlessly intelligent and emotionally remote, a man who had not been seen to smile since his wife's death 3 years ago. She closed her secret ledger, tucking it beneath a stack of household receipts. Then she rose, smoothing the front of her plain gray dress. It was mended at the cuff, the fabric worn thin but impeccably clean. She retrieved the charity accounts from the locked drawer of her desk. The book was heavy, bound in dark green leather, its columns of figures neat as a regiment of soldiers. She had balanced it to the last half-penny only yesterday. Whatever Mr. Severn wanted, he would find it in perfect order. She entered the parlor to a scene of strained theatricality. Her aunt was perched on the edge of the settee, her expression a careful blend of social grace and maternal pride. Louisa, resplendent in a new dress of blue muslin, paid for, Prudence knew, by the sale of a bond from her own inheritance, was fluttering her eyelashes and offering Mr. Severn a cup of tea. Gideon Severn ignored her. He stood by the window, a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His features were too harsh, his expression too severe. He looked, Prudence thought, like a bird of prey, all sharp angles and watchful stillness. When he turned, his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, swept past Mrs. Ingram and Louisa as if they were furniture and landed on the ledger in Prudence's hands. "You are Miss Bellamy?" he asked. His voice was low and clipped, devoid of pleasantry. "I am," Prudence said. "You maintain these accounts?" "I do." "My thanks for your promptness," he said, the words directed at her, but seeming to dismiss everyone else in the room. "Mrs. Ingram, I have concerns regarding a discrepancy in the quarterly reports. A significant donation appears to have been recorded, but not accounted for in the final disbursement." Mrs. Ingram's face paled. "A discrepancy? Surely not. My Prudence is so very careful." She cast a sharp, warning glance at her niece. Prudence felt a familiar, cold dread. She knew of no such discrepancy. But her aunt had a habit of making private pledges she could not fund, assuming Prudence could somehow conjure the money from the ether. "May I?" Gideon Severn said, gesturing not to a chair, but to the small, clear space on the center table. It was a command, not a request. Prudence placed the heavy ledger on the table. He did not sit. He leaned over it, his presence dominating the room. He turned the pages with a brisk efficiency, his long fingers tracing the columns of her neat script. Louisa began to offer a comment about the weather, but a single, arctic glance from Mr. Severn silenced her. "The donation from the Dowager Lady Sinclair," he said, his fingers stabbing at a line. £500, recorded here on the 5th of April. The disbursement report for the second quarter, however, shows a total expenditure that is precisely £500 less than the total income. Mrs. Ingram began to bluster. "A simple clerical error, I am sure. Prudence, dear, you must have—" "There is no error," Prudence said, her voice quiet but clear. The two heads, one florid and agitated, one dark and severe, turned to her. She felt a tremor of fear, but her voice remained steady. "The donation was received on the 5th, as recorded. The disbursement report was for the quarter ending on the 31st of March. Lady Sinclair's donation will be accounted for in the third quarter report. You will find the funds, in their entirety, listed in the account balance on page 112. She reached past him and turned the pages with unerring accuracy. There it was, an entry in her own hand, balance carried forward, followed by the exact sum. Silence descended upon the room, a thick, heavy silence. Gideon Severn stared at the page, then at Prudence. His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were assaying a piece of gold. He was not looking at her plain dress or her unremarkable face. He was looking at her mind, laid bare in columns of ink. "I see," he said at last. The two words were an admission. He had come expecting incompetence or corruption, the usual mire of small-town charity. He had found, instead, an unassailable fortress of fact. He straightened up, his gaze still holding hers. It was not a social glance. It was one of assessment, of recognition. For the first time in a very long time, Prudence felt seen. Not as a drudge, not as a convenience, but as a professional. The feeling was as shocking and unfamiliar as a jolt of lightning. As he looked at her, his eyes flickered down for a fraction of a second to her wrist, where the faint, purplish shadow of her aunt's grip from that morning was just visible beneath her cuff. He said nothing. His expression did not change. But Prudence had the unnerving sensation that he had just read a line in a secret ledger she did not know she possessed. "My apologies for the intrusion, Mrs. Ingram," he said, his tone making it clear no apology was actually offered. "My concerns are alleviated." He turned to Prudence. "Miss Bellamy, your work is exemplary." And with a stiff, formal bow that encompassed no one but her, he turned and left the room. The front door clicked shut behind him, leaving a profound and unnerving silence in his wake. Mrs. Ingram rounded on Prudence, her face a mask of fury. "You see what you've done? Humiliating me in front of him, making me look a fool!" "I presented the facts, Aunt," Prudence said, her voice weary. "The facts were in our favor." "Facts?" her aunt hissed. "What does a man like that care for facts?" "He came to be charmed, to be managed, and you stood there like a pallbearer at a funeral." Prudence did not answer. She simply picked up the green leather ledger. Its weight felt different in her hands now. Heavier, more significant. She had been weighed and measured by the most formidable man in the county, and for the first time in her life, she had not been found wanting. Back in her room, she did not immediately open her secret ledger. She stood at the window, looking out at the neat, confining gardens of Marley. For the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different column of figures. Not debts, but assets. Not losses, but possibilities. It was a foolish, dangerous thought, and she quickly pushed it away. But it had been sparked, a tiny ember in the cold, gray ash of her life. And it had been sparked by the chilling, appreciative gaze of Gideon Severn. The week that followed Mr. Severn's visit was one of tense, simmering silence in the Ingram household. Mrs. Ingram treated Prudence with a frosty displeasure, while Louisa complained incessantly of boredom. Prudence retreated into her work, the familiar rhythm of accounts and receipts a shield against the unspoken resentments that filled the air. She tried to forget the incident, to dismiss the strange flicker of recognition in Gideon Severn's eyes as a trick of the light. But the memory lingered, a single, clear note in a life of monotonous noise. Then, on a Tuesday, a carriage bearing the Severn crest, a stark, elegant hawk in flight, drew up before the house. It was not Mr. Severn who emerged, but his man of business, a severe-looking solicitor named Mr. Abbott, who carried a heavy leather portfolio. He was shown into the parlor, and Mrs. Ingram was summoned. Prudence, from her small office down the hall, heard the low murmur of voices, her aunt's initially bright and social, then gradually more strained. Louisa was dispatched to her room with a sharp word. Prudence kept her head down, her pen scratching its steady path across a page of figures. Whatever business Mr. Severn had with her aunt, it was surely no concern of hers. An hour passed. The murmur from the parlor ceased. Then, her aunt's voice, sharp and brittle as glass. "Prudence! In here! At once!" Prudence set down her pen, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She entered the parlor to find her aunt standing by the fireplace, her face flushed, a single sheet of paper crumpled in her fist. Mr. Abbott sat ramrod straight in a chair, his expression impassive. He held a document bound with a red ribbon. "Mr. Abbott has brought a proposal," Mrs. Ingram said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "From Mr. Severn." Prudence waited. A proposal? For Louisa, perhaps? A match with Gideon Severn would be the social coup of the century. It would solve all of her aunt's financial woes. So why the rage?
He has offered, Mrs. Ingram choked out the words, to settle the entirety of your late uncle's outstanding debts, the ones owed to his father's bank.
Prudence's breath caught. She knew of these debts. They were a dark cloud that had hung over the family for years, the true source of their precarious financial state. The sum was staggering. For it to be forgiven, it was a miracle. And, her aunt continued, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, he has offered to provide a dowry for Louisa, a generous one, enough to secure her a match with Viscount Draycott. This was everything her aunt had ever schemed and prayed for. The family saved from ruin, her daughter married into the aristocracy. Prudence looked at her aunt's face and saw no joy, only a deep, malignant anger. There is a condition, Mrs. Ingram spat. Mr. Abbott cleared his throat. Mr. Severn's proposal is indeed conditional, he said, his voice dry as dust. The settlement of debts and the provision of the dowry are contingent upon his marriage to Miss Prudence Bellamy. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Prudence stared, speechless, from the lawyer's bland face to her aunt's contorted one. It was impossible. A joke. A cruel, incomprehensible mistake. He wishes to marry me? The words were a faint breath. It is an absurdity, Mrs. Ingram shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. An insult! He was offered a pearl, and he has chosen a pebble. A plain, penniless little pebble. Prudence flinched as if struck. The words were nothing she had not thought about herself in her darkest moments, but to hear them spoken aloud, with such venom, by her own kin. Mr. Severn was quite clear in his instructions, Mr. Abbott said, his gaze fixed on a point just over Mrs. Ingram's shoulder. His reasons, as he stated them to me, are practical. Kestrel Chase is a vast and complex enterprise that has been neglected. He requires a wife who can serve as its mistress in a true managerial capacity. He requires, and I quote, a woman of proven competence, unimpeachable honesty, and a head for figures. The lawyer's eyes flickered briefly towards Prudence. He was most impressed, Miss Bellamy, by your handling of the charity accounts. So that was it. It was not a proposal of marriage in any romantic sense. It was a job offer. The most bizarre, unorthodox job offer in history. He was not seeking a wife. He was hiring a chief financial officer. And he was willing to pay a king's ransom for the right candidate. It is a business arrangement, Mr. Abbott concluded smoothly. The terms are laid out here. He tapped the ribbon-bound document. She will not do it, Mrs. Ingram declared. I forbid it. To be mistress of Kestrel Chase. It is Louisa's right. With respect, madam, Mr. Abbott said, a hint of steel entering his voice. The offer is not made to you. And without this arrangement, the bank will be forced to call in your late husband's loans. I believe you understand the consequences of that. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. Ruin. Public disgrace. The loss of everything Mrs. Ingram held dear. Her face crumpled, the rage replaced by the stark, ugly face of fear. She looked at Prudence, and in her eyes was a new kind of hatred, the hatred of the dependent for the one on whom they depend. Prudence was no longer just a useful drudge. She was the key, and her aunt was trapped. Later that evening, after Mr. Abbott had departed, leaving the papers on the table, Prudence found herself summoned to Gideon Severn's townhouse. He had requested a private word with her. Her aunt had tried to refuse, but Prudence, in a moment of unprecedented rebellion, had simply put on her bonnet and cloak and walked out the door. She was shown into a stark, masculine study. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt cold. Gideon Severn stood waiting for her. He did not offer her a seat.
"Miss Bellamy," he began, without preamble, "you have heard my proposal."
"I have heard your terms," she corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. "Yes, the terms. Let us be plain. I require a partner, not of the heart, but of the house. Kestrel Chase is failing. My late wife was not suited to its management. The staff is demoralized, the accounts are in chaos, the entire estate is bleeding money. I have neither the time nor the temperament to rectify it myself. My skills lie in industry, not domesticity." He paused, his pale gray eyes fixed on her. "I observed you, Miss Bellamy. At your aunt's house, and in the pages of that ledger, you possess a quality I find exceedingly rare. You are ruthlessly competent. You see order where others see chaos. You value fact over sentiment. I value that." "You wish to hire me as your housekeeper," Prudence said flatly. "But to give me the authority I would need, you must give me your name." "Precisely," he said, with no hint of embarrassment. "The mistress of the house cannot be overruled. A housekeeper can be dismissed. The arrangement grants you total authority over the domestic sphere. In return, you will bring Kestrel Chase to order. You will have an unlimited budget, but I expect it to be accounted for. You will have my name, my protection, and a life of considerable comfort. You will never again have to count your own inheritance being spent on dancing slippers." The direct reference to her plight was a shock. He had not just seen her competence, he had seen her cage. He was offering her a different one, larger, more gilded, but a cage nonetheless. "What do you ask of me in return?" she asked, her voice low. "As a wife?" "Your loyalty," he said instantly. "Your discretion. Your presence at my table twice a week for dinner. Your attendance at the 4 or 5 social events a year I cannot avoid. Beyond that, your life is your own. My life is my own. The east wing of the house will be yours. I reside in the west. It is a contract, nothing more." Prudence looked at him, this strange, cold, brilliant man. He was offering her an escape, but on his terms. She would be trading one form of servitude for another. But what a difference! To be the overlooked drudge in a crumbling townhouse, or the undisputed mistress of a grand estate. To be exploited for pennies, or to command fortunes. She thought of her secret ledger. She thought of a lifetime of being told she was a plain, penniless pebble. And she made a decision. She would not be a pebble. She would be a fortress. "I accept your arrangement, Mr. Severn," she said, her voice clear and strong. "On one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "The authority you mention. It must be absolute. No one, not you, not your staff, not my aunt, may question my decisions regarding the household, the accounts, or the management of the estate. My word in that domain must be final." He gave a short, sharp nod. "Of course, that is the purpose of the arrangement." He extended a hand, not for her to kiss, not for her to hold, but to shake. It was a gesture between two men of business sealing a deal. Prudence placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, cool, and impersonal. "Then we have an agreement, Mrs. Severn," he said, using the name for the first time. It sounded foreign, like a word in a language she did not speak. "It seems we do, Mr. Severn," she replied, withdrawing her hand. The marriage took place 2 weeks later, a swift, sterile affair at the magistrate's office. Prudence wore her best dress, a simple brown wool. Gideon wore a dark suit. The only witnesses were Mr. Abbott and a bewildered clerk. There were no flowers, no music, no congratulations. It was the signing of a contract, nothing more. As she left her aunt's house for the last time, Prudence did not look back. Mrs. Ingram stood at the door, her face a thunderous mask of defeat.
Louisa wept, not for the loss of Prudence, but for the indignity of the whole affair.
Prudence felt nothing. She was leaving a prison. What lay ahead was unknown, but it could not be worse than what she was leaving behind. She carried with her a single small portmanteau and the worn, secret ledger, which she had not yet decided whether to burn or to keep. It was the only part of her old life she considered her own. The carriage ride to Kestrel Chase was silent. Gideon sat opposite her, staring out the window at the passing fields. He did not speak, and Prudence asked for nothing. The arrangement had begun. She was no longer Prudence Bellamy, the poor relation. She was Mrs. Severn, the new mistress of Kestrel Chase, a title she had acquired, a role she had to perform. And as the great grey stone house came into view, looming against the sky like a sleeping giant, she knew her work was about to begin. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of the long, sweeping drive to Kestrel Chase, the sound unnervingly loud in the profound quiet of the estate. The house rose before them, a masterpiece of Palladian architecture, symmetrical and grand, but it had the forlorn, unloved air of a museum after closing time. Its pale stone walls were streaked with green damp, and many of the dozens of windows were dark and shuttered, like blind eyes. The gardens, once famous throughout the county, were a tangled wilderness of overgrown roses and encroaching weeds. The entire place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Gideon had not spoken a word since they left Marley. As the carriage halted, he finally turned to her, his expression as unreadable as the stone facade of his home. "Welcome to Kestrel Chase, Mrs. Severn," he said. The formality was a wall between them. "Mrs. Kemble, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. I have business in the library." And with that, he was gone, striding into the house without a backward glance. He had delivered the package to its destination. His part in the transfer was complete. Prudence stood alone for a moment on the wide stone steps, a solitary figure in a vast landscape. A cold wind whipped around the corner of the house, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. This was her new home, her new cage, gilded though it might be. The great oak doors swung open to reveal a woman who seemed carved from the same stern material as the house itself. She was tall and thin, dressed in severe black, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features into a permanent state of disapproval. This was Mrs. Kemble. "Madam," she said, the word clipped, her curtsy so shallow it was almost an insult. Her eyes, small and sharp, raked over Prudence's plain travelling dress and single portmanteau with unconcealed disdain. She had clearly been expecting a society belle dripping with jewels, not this drab sparrow. "Mrs. Kemble," Prudence acknowledged, her voice calm. "Mr. Severn has indicated you will show me to my rooms." "The east wing," the housekeeper said. her tone suggesting it was a place of exile. As requested. She led the way. The great hall was cavernous and cold. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting from the high, grimy windows. Furniture stood shrouded in white dust cloths, like a gathering of ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of disuse, of beeswax polish long faded, and fires long dead. It was the physical embodiment of Gideon's grief, a house frozen in the moment of its master's loss. They walked in silence through echoing corridors and up a sweeping, uncarpeted staircase. Mrs. Kemble pointed out rooms with a curt nod. The ballroom, unused. The drawing room, closed. The late Mrs. Seven's morning room, locked. Each statement was a small act of aggression, a reminder that Prudence was an intruder here, a usurper of a dead woman's place. Prudence did not react. She merely observed.
She noted the threadbare runner in the upper hall, the water stain spreading across the ceiling, the fine layer of dust on every surface. She was not a guest to be impressed or intimidated. She was a general surveying a battlefield. The east wing was a self-contained apartment of handsome but neglected rooms. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room. The furniture was good, but dusty. The hearth was swept clean, but empty and cold. "Will there be anything else, madam?" Mrs. Kemble asked, her hand already on the doorknob, eager to be gone. "Yes," Prudence said, setting her small bag down. "I will require the household account books, all of them, for the last 5 years, and the keys to all rooms in this house, including the late Mrs. Severn's morning room. Please have them brought to the estate office in 1 hour." Mrs. Kemble froze, her back stiffening. "The office? But, madam, your rooms—" "I will not be occupying these rooms just yet," Prudence said calmly. "My place is in the estate office. That is where I will be working. And sleeping, if necessary, until the house is in order." She turned to face the housekeeper, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I am the mistress of this house now, Mrs. Kemble. That is not a social title. It is a job description. The books and the keys, in 1 hour." The housekeeper stared for a moment, nonplussed. She had expected tears or tantrums or pleas for comfort. She had not expected this quiet, unyielding authority. A flicker of something, begrudging respect, perhaps, showed in her eyes before she masked it. "Very good, madam," she said, and this time the madam held a fraction less contempt. She departed, leaving Prudence alone in the chilly silence. Prudence did not waste a moment. She made her own way back down through the labyrinthine corridors to the estate office. It was a small, grim room at the back of the house, smelling of dry rot and forgotten papers. She opened the shutters, letting in the gray light. The desk was thick with dust. She found a rag and wiped it down herself. Exactly 1 hour later, a footman arrived, laden with a mountain of dusty ledgers. Behind him was Mrs. Kemble, a large iron ring of keys in her hand. She placed them on the desk with a thud. "The accounts, madam," she said. "And the keys." "Thank you, Mrs. Kemble," Prudence said, already pulling the first ledger towards her. "That will be all for now." And so began her campaign. For the first week, Prudence was a ghost in the house. She rose before dawn and worked late into the night, fueled by tea and bread and cheese brought to her on a tray. She spoke to no one, demanded nothing for herself. She simply worked. The ledgers told a story of chaos and neglect. Tradesmen were overcharging by as much as 50%. Suppliers were billing for goods never delivered. Wages were in arrears. There were debts to local businesses that were a source of shame and resentment in the village. Prudence began to create her own set of books, a new, clean ledger
where the truth of Kestrel Chase could be written. She worked with a ferocious concentration, her mind a sharp, clear instrument cutting through the fog of mismanagement. She found patterns, discrepancies, a web of lazy corruption and simple waste that was strangling the estate. On the third day, she sent a note to Gideon, a simple, one-line request for a meeting. He found her in the office, surrounded by stacks of paper, a smudge of ink on her cheek. "Mr. Severn," she began without preamble, "the butcher, Mr. Hobbs, has been charging the estate for prime cuts and delivering stewing meat. The bill for the last year is inflated by at least £100. The hay merchant, Mr. Gable, has short-weighted every delivery for the past 6 months. I estimate a loss of £30. The wine merchant in Marley is billing us for French brandy that was never received. I require your permission to terminate these contracts and seek new suppliers." Gideon listened, his expression unreadable. He had expected her to complain about the cold rooms, the hostile staff, the loneliness. Instead, she brought him facts, figures, a strategy. "You have proof?" he asked. "I have invoices, delivery dockets, and the testimony of the head groom, who was willing to speak once I assured him his position was secure," she said, pushing a neat file of papers across the desk. "It is all documented." He looked at the file, then back at her. "You have my permission," he said, "and my full support. Do what you must." He left, and Prudence went back to her work. But something had shifted. The first test had been met. Her reforms were not popular at first. The dismissed tradesmen grumbled in the village. The staff, accustomed to a lax regime, were wary of this new, quietly efficient mistress. But then, small changes began to happen. On Friday, Prudence summoned the footmen and paid them their back wages, in full, with an extra shilling for their patience. She did the same for the maids, the grooms, the gardeners. The money came from a small coffer she had established by settling a disputed bill with a London stationer in the estate's favor. Then came the moment with Mrs. Kemble. While reviewing the apothecary bills, Prudence noticed a recurring, unauthorized expense for expensive liniment and extra woolen blankets. She traced it not to the house accounts, but to a deduction from Mrs. Kemble's own salary. The housekeeper, Prudence realized with a jolt, was using her own money to care for the older, arthritic servants, like the laundry maid Hannah and the elderly butler Perkins. Prudence did not confront her. Instead, she drew up a new document. The next morning, she summoned Mrs. Kemble to the office. The housekeeper entered with her usual defensive posture. "Mrs. Kemble," Prudence said, "I have been reviewing the staff welfare provisions. They are inadequate." She pushed a paper across the desk. "This is a proposal for an estate pension fund for servants who have given more than 20 years of service. It also establishes a formal budget for medical supplies and comforts to be managed by you at your discretion. I require your signature as a witness." Mrs. Kemble stared at the paper. She read it once, then twice. Her iron composure seemed to crack. Her lips trembled for a moment. She looked at Prudence, and the suspicion in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, reluctant understanding. This new mistress was not cruel. She was just. "Madam," the housekeeper said, her voice thick with an emotion Prudence could not name. This is right." She took the pen and signed her name with a firm, steady hand. It was the turning of a tide. The loyalty of the house, which could not be commanded, had been earned. That afternoon, when Prudence returned to her rooms in the East Wing, she found a fire blazing in the hearth, a vase of late-blooming chrysanthemums on the mantel, and the bed turned down with sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. The house was beginning to wake up. Gideon observed all of this from his self-imposed distance. He saw the dust cloths disappear from the furniture. He heard the distant sound of a piano being tuned. He smelled the scent of bread baking for the first time in years. The house was slowly, quietly, coming back to life around him. His fortress of grief was being dismantled, not with loud assaults, but with quiet competence and small acts of order. He found himself looking for her. He started taking his evening meal not in his study, but in the small dining room, knowing she would be there. Their conversations were still formal, revolving around estate business, the new roof for the tenant farm, the planting schedule for the spring, the accounts. But the silence between the facts was becoming less empty. One evening he watched her as she detailed a plan to restore the walled gardens, her face animated as she spoke of crop rotation and cold frames. He saw not a clerk, but a creator, a woman who brought order from chaos, life from neglect. "The arrangement," he said abruptly, cutting across her words about rosemary bushes. "Is it satisfactory?" Prudence looked up, surprised by the personal question. "I have been given the authority I was promised," she said carefully. "The work is progressing." "That is not what I asked," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I asked if it is satisfactory. To you." She met his gaze across the polished mahogany of the table. "I have a purpose here, Mr. Severn," she said. "For the first time in my life, my work has value." "Yes," she concluded, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "It is satisfactory." He nodded slowly, his pale eyes holding hers for a long moment. It was not a look of passion or even affection. It was something harder to define. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the look one gives an equal. And in the cold, grand house of Kestrel Chase, it was the first sign of a thaw. The quiet, ordered world Prudence was building at Kestrel Chase was a fragile one, and she soon learned it was not immune to the envy and malice of the world outside its gates. News of the strange, swift marriage had spread through the county like wildfire, and with it, a storm of speculation. The most virulent gossip emanated from a source Prudence knew all too well: her former home. Mrs. Ingram, robbed of her grand prize, now painted herself as the victim of a cunning, manipulative niece, and she found a willing and powerful ally in her campaign of slander. Arabella Devereux was the reigning belle of the county, a woman of flawless beauty, impeccable lineage, and venomous charm. She had long considered Gideon Severn her own personal project, a magnificent, wounded creature she would eventually tame and marry. His sudden marriage to a penniless, plain nobody was not just a disappointment. It was a public humiliation. And Arabella did not suffer humiliation lightly. The first salvos were fired in the drawing rooms and at the dinner parties of Marley. Whispers followed Prudence whenever she ventured into town for supplies. They said she was an upstart, a schemer who had used some form of blackmail to trap the grieving widower. Mrs. Ingram, with crocodile tears and feigned reluctance, would confirm these suspicions. "Poor Prudence," she would sigh to a circle of rapt listeners. "She always had an unnatural obsession with money and status. I fear she has played a very deep game with poor Mr. Severn." Prudence ignored the gossip. She had work to do, but the whispers began to have real-world consequences. A London merchant she had been negotiating with for new linens suddenly became evasive. An invitation to join the board of the very charity she had once run was mysteriously withdrawn. She was being slowly, quietly ostracized. That is how counties turn on their own, quietly, by degrees. Gideon was aware of the rumors. "Pay them no mind," he said, his tone dismissive. "Their opinions are of no value." But Prudence saw the way old acquaintances would avoid his eye at the market, the way conversations would halt when he approached. Her presence was costing him. The arrangement, she realized, had a clause she had not anticipated: social ruin. The opposition escalated from whispers to a direct attack, and it came from a direction they did not expect. The architect of the plot was not Arabella herself, but her brother, Fletcher Devereux. He was a man who possessed all of his sister's arrogance, but none of her polish, a handsome wastrel known for his gambling debts and shady business dealings. He saw in Gideon's social isolation an opportunity.
Gideon, in his capacity as a county magnate, was the chief trustee of the Penhalton Agricultural Fund, a large endowment established to support tenant farmers. One autumn morning, a letter arrived from Sir Leopold Yardley, the county magistrate and a fellow trustee. It was a summons to an urgent meeting. The letter was polite but firm. There was a problem. Gideon returned to Kestrel Chase that evening, looking grimmer than Prudence had ever seen him. He found her in the office, finalizing the winter budget. "There is a shortfall in the Penhalton Fund," he said, standing in the doorway, his tall frame seeming to block out the light. "A significant one. £10,000. Prudence looked up, her pen still. "A shortfall or a theft?" "A transfer was made from the fund's account 2 months ago," he explained, his voice tight. "A wire to a firm of investors in London. The instruction letter for the transfer bears my signature. And yours." Prudence stared at him. "Mine? I have no connection to the Penhalton Fund." "As my wife, your signature is now required on any transaction over £5,000 from any of my trustee accounts. A new rule Sir Leopold insisted upon after my marriage, for the sake of propriety and transparency." He gave a short, bitter laugh. It seems his caution was warranted. "But I signed no such letter," Prudence said, her mind racing. "Nevertheless, the bank has it. And the signature, they say, is a perfect match for the one on our marriage certificate." He paused, and the next words fell like stones into the quiet room. "The firm the money was transferred to, Coastal Trading Ventures, is a shell company, and its registered director is a man named Thomas Bellamy." Prudence felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas Bellamy. Her father's disgraced cousin, a gambler and a drunkard, a man her family had not spoken of in 20 years, a man whose existence she had almost forgotten. "It is a trap, Gideon," she whispered. The use of his first name slipped out, unnoticed by either of them in the gravity of the moment. "A brilliant one," he conceded, his voice harsh. "It implicates me in a breach of trust, and you as the instrument and beneficiary. It suggests I have plundered a charitable fund to enrich my wife's disreputable family." Fletcher Devereux presented the evidence to Sir Leopold this morning. He claimed he was investigating coastal trading for another matter when he stumbled upon the transaction. He played the part of the concerned citizen to perfection. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The slander, the social isolation, it was all a prelude,
preparing the ground for this public execution. Arabella and Fletcher, with Mrs. Ingram providing the personal details, like the existence of a cousin Thomas, had woven a near-perfect snare. "They will have used my handwriting from letters," Prudence murmured, thinking aloud. "My aunt has dozens of them. Notes, instructions, lists." "The letter of instruction," Gideon said, "is described as being written in a precise, neat hand, just like yours." The attack was not just on him. It was aimed directly at the heart of her identity. Her competence, her honesty, her meticulous nature, the very qualities he had married her for, were being twisted into weapons against them. They had taken her greatest strength and forged it into a mark of guilt. "Sir Leopold has called a formal inquiry," Gideon continued, "in 3 days' time, at the town assembly rooms. He wishes to resolve this matter with discretion, but Devereux will ensure it is a public spectacle. He will have witnesses. He will have the documents." For a fleeting moment, Prudence felt a wave of pure despair. They were caught. The evidence was forged, but it existed. A letter, a bank transfer, a name, facts. The very currency she dealt in. How could they fight against facts, even false ones? She looked up at Gideon.
His face was a mask of cold fury, but in his eyes she saw something else. A flicker of an old wound, the shadow of a past betrayal. She did not know the details of his first marriage, only that it had ended in tragedy, and that he had sealed himself off from the world afterward. Now, the world had broken in again, with another lie, another betrayal centered on his wife. He was watching her, his gaze impossibly intense. Waiting. He was waiting to see if she would crumble, if she would weep or protest. She did not. She straightened her shoulders. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her mind was already working, searching for a path, a flaw in the trap. "They think they have cornered us with paper," she said, her voice regaining its quiet strength. "But a lie on paper is still a lie. We must find the truth and put it on paper as well." Gideon's expression did not change, but she saw a subtle shift in his posture, a lessening of the tension in his shoulders. He had seen what he was looking for. She was not going to break. She was going to fight. "They have given us 3 days," he said, his voice now a low, determined growl. "We will use them." The house, which had been slowly warming to life, fell silent once more. But this was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of a fortress preparing for a siege, and inside, its master and mistress, bound not by love, but by a contract and a common enemy, began to plan their war. The 2 days that followed were the longest of Prudence's life. A heavy, oppressive silence descended upon Kestrel Chase, broken only by the frantic scratching of pens and the rustle of papers. Gideon dispatched agents to London to investigate Fletcher Devereux and coastal trading ventures. Prudence, meanwhile, barricaded herself in the estate office, turning her formidable mind to the problem of the forgery. She knew it was the linchpin of the entire accusation. If she could prove the letter was not hers, the whole conspiracy would begin to unravel. She spent hours poring over her own handwriting, examining old letters, household accounts, even her childhood copybooks. She was searching for the unique, unconscious habits of her hand, the precise angle of her T crossings, the way she looped her G's, the pressure she applied on a downstroke.
She was trying to distill the essence of her own identity onto a single sheet of diagnostic paper. It was a strange, disembodying task to see oneself reduced to a collection of calligraphic ticks. On the evening of the second day, Gideon returned from a tense meeting in Marley. He found her asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on a stack of ledgers, a single lamp casting a warm glow on her exhausted face. For a long moment, he simply stood in the doorway and watched her. He saw not the plain, competent woman he had married, but a warrior resting between battles. The sight stirred something in him, a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. He had married her for her mind, for her skills. He had not anticipated this feeling of alliance, of shared vulnerability. He gently touched her shoulder. She started awake, her eyes wide and unfocused for a moment, before clearing with sharp intelligence. "Any news?" she asked immediately, her own exhaustion forgotten. "My agents in London have confirmed that coastal trading is a fiction, set up 3 months ago," he said, his voice grim. "And they have found a link, however tenuous, between Fletcher Devereux and your cousin Thomas. They were seen together at a gaming hell in Cheapside. It's circumstantial, not enough." "Then the letter is everything," she said, her shoulders slumping slightly. "And we have no way to disprove it without seeing it." The weight of their predicament settled between them. The inquiry was the next day. They were going into it blind, with no definitive proof to counter the seemingly irrefutable evidence against them.
Gideon walked over to the window, staring out at the dark, wind-swept parkland. He was a man who trusted evidence, who built his life on a foundation of hard facts, and all the facts were aligned against them. He remembered another time, years ago, when a business partner had betrayed him, using forged documents to siphon away a fortune. Gideon had been ruined, his name disgraced. It had taken him 2 years of relentless, solitary work to expose the fraud and rebuild his life. The experience had scarred him, leaving him with a deep-seated suspicion of all human relationships and a reliance on the cold, hard certainty of proof. His first wife, a beautiful, fragile creature, had been unable to withstand the scandal and the ensuing hardship. Her decline had begun then. He had failed to protect her. The memory was a shard of ice in his heart. And now, history was repeating itself. Another forgery, another betrayal, another wife caught in the crossfire. But Prudence was not his first wife. She was not fragile. She had not crumpled under the pressure. She had met the crisis with a clear head and a fighting spirit. He had married her to be the manager of his house. He had not expected her to become the captain of his guard. He turned back from the window. The moment of decision was upon him. He could trust the evidence, which pointed to her guilt, or at least to a situation so compromised as to be indefensible. Or he could trust her. He could trust the woman who paid her servants' wages before her own, who found a way to care for the old and infirm, who could bring a dying house back to life through sheer force of will and integrity. It was a leap of faith, an act of unreason that went against every instinct he had cultivated for years. He walked back to the desk. He sat down in the chair opposite her, the lamp throwing their faces into sharp relief. "Prudence," he said, his voice low and serious. "Tomorrow, in that room, Sir Leopold will present the letter, the evidence. It will look damning. People will believe it. It may be that I cannot disprove it. We may be ruined. My name will be dragged through the mud, and yours with it.
We will lose Kestrel Chase. We will lose everything. He paused, his pale eyes searching her face. If there is anything you have not told me, any connection to this, however innocent, now is the time. It was the final test, a chance for her to confess, a chance for him to doubt. Prudence looked at him. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the battle between his past hurts and his present reality. She understood, with a sudden, piercing clarity, what he was asking. He was not asking if she was guilty. He was asking if she was strong enough to withstand being treated as if she were. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. Her gaze did not waver. "Gideon," she said, and the name was now a firm, solid thing between them. "I did not write that letter. I have no connection to this fraud. My only connection is to you and to this house. I gave you my word when we made our arrangement. I will not break it. Whatever comes tomorrow, we will face it. Together." The word hung in the air. Together. It was not a word that had been part of their contract. Gideon stared at her for one long, silent moment. He saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. He saw the steady line of her mouth. He saw the ink stains on her fingers, the marks of her tireless work on their behalf. And in that moment, he made a choice. He chose the woman over the evidence. He chose the unproven truth of her character over the proven falsehood of a forged document. A slow, deliberate change came over his face. The harsh lines softened. The cold mask of control seemed to melt away, revealing the determined man beneath. He reached across the desk and took the pen from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, electric. He took a blank sheet of paper.
"You are right," he said, his voice imbued with a new, vibrant energy. "They think they have cornered us with paper. Let's show them what paper can truly do." He began to write, his hand moving swiftly across the page. It was not a defense. It was a list. A list of questions. A list of witnesses to call. A strategy of attack. Prudence watched him, a slow warmth spreading through her chest. It was not hope, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was the feeling of not being alone. The doubt had been met and vanquished. The crisis had passed. Trust, fragile and new, had been forged in the fire. Whatever happened tomorrow, the most important battle had already been won, here, in the quiet of the night, in this small, lamplit room. They were no longer two individuals bound by a contract. They were a partnership, and they were ready for the reckoning. The assembly rooms in Marley were packed. It seemed the entire county had turned out for the spectacle, drawn by the irresistible lure of a great man's potential fall. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and mothballs, and a low, vicious murmur of speculation. Prudence walked through the crowd at Gideon's side, her head held high. She felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny pinpricks of malice and curiosity. She saw Arabella Devereux in the front row, resplendent in a gown of emerald green, a triumphant smile playing on her perfect lips. Beside her, Fletcher looked sleek and confident, the very picture of a concerned citizen. And near them, her Aunt Ingram, draped in black like a professional mourner, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, ready to perform her part. Prudence felt a tremor of stage fright, but then Gideon's hand brushed against hers,
a brief, grounding touch. Together. The inquiry began. Sir Leopold Yardley, a man whose stern face and reputation for fairness were the only bulwarks against the proceedings descending into a witch hunt, called the room to order. He laid out the situation in stark, simple terms. A large sum of money was missing from the Penhalton Fund, and a letter of instruction, apparently signed by Mr. and Mrs. Severn, had authorized the transfer. Fletcher Devereux was called as the first witness. He was masterful. He spoke with feigned reluctance, painting himself as a man who, through a painful sense of duty, was forced to bring this terrible business to light. He presented the timeline, the bank drafts, and finally, with a dramatic flourish, the letter itself. It was passed to Sir Leopold, who examined it grimly before handing it to Gideon. Gideon took the letter. He read it, his face impassive. Then he passed it to Prudence. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked at the document that was meant to destroy them. The handwriting was a chillingly accurate imitation of her own. The forger had captured the neatness, the precision, the very essence of her careful script. For a moment, even she felt a dizzying sense of doubt. Could she have written it in some fugue state? But then her training, her lifetime of meticulous observation took over. She forced herself to look closer, to see past the overall impression to the minute details. And she found them. 1, 2, 3 tiny telltale flaws. A T crossed with a slightly heavier, more masculine stroke than her own. A final S that curved in a way she never made. And the ink. It was just slightly blacker, with less of the brownish, oxidized tint of the iron gall ink she used at Kestrel Chase. They were minute, almost invisible discrepancies, but to her, they screamed forgery. "Mr. Devereux," Sir Leopold said, "this is a grave accusation. Do you have any further evidence to support your claim that Mrs. Severn was the architect of this scheme?" "I do, Sir Leopold," Fletcher said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "I call Mrs. Eleanor Ingram." Aunt Ingram took the stand, a study in tragic bereavement. She wept as she spoke of Prudence's unnatural and scheming nature. "She was always so grasping," she sobbed. "Obsessed with ledgers and figures from the time she was a girl. It wasn't natural in a young woman. I tried to guide her, to teach her the softer arts, but her heart was always cold, always calculating. When she trapped poor Mr. Severn, I knew it was only a matter of time before her ambition led to some terrible end." It was a devastating performance. The room was rapt. Prudence felt the tide of public opinion turn definitively against her. She was a monster, a cold-hearted schemer who had finally been unmasked. When her aunt finished, Sir Leopold turned to Gideon. "Mr. Severn, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" "I do, Sir Leopold," Gideon said, rising to his feet. His voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "But I will not be the one to respond. I call my wife, Mrs. Prudence Severn." A gasp went through the crowd. This was highly irregular, but Sir Leopold, his interest piqued, nodded his assent. Prudence walked to the stand, her steps even, her back straight. She did not look at her aunt, or at Arabella, or at the hostile faces in the crowd. She looked only at Sir Leopold. She was not asked to speak about the forgery. Gideon's first question was disarmingly simple. "Mrs. Severn, could you please describe for the Assembly your duties in your aunt's household for the 10 years prior to our marriage?" Prudence paused, then began to speak. Her voice was low and clear, devoid of emotion. She did not complain. She did not accuse. She simply stated facts. She described managing the household accounts, negotiating with tradesmen, stretching a shrinking budget. And then she spoke of the Marley Women's Relief Fund. "For 5 years," she said, "I was the fund's unacknowledged administrator. I kept the books, I solicited the donations, I managed the disbursements. Mrs. Ingram, as chairwoman, lent her name to the enterprise." She then produced a ledger, not her secret one, but a perfect, hand-copied duplicate of the charity's accounts. "This is a record of every penny," she said. She proceeded to detail, with flawless memory, 3 separate occasions when her aunt had attempted to borrow from the charity funds for personal use, and how she, Prudence, had blocked the transactions and replaced the money from her own meager allowance. She called the charity's timid treasurer as a witness. He nervously but truthfully confirmed every word. The first cracks appeared in Mrs. Ingram's facade of saintly victimhood. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with a different tone. Then Gideon moved to the forgery. "Mrs. Severn," he asked, "you have examined the letter. Do you recognize the handwriting?" "I recognize it as a deliberate and skillful attempt to imitate my own," Prudence said calmly. "But it is not mine." She then did something extraordinary. She addressed Sir Leopold directly. "Sir, a forger can copy the shape of letters, but it is very difficult to copy the ingrained habits of a lifetime of writing. The speed, the pressure, the rhythm. May I demonstrate?" Intrigued, Sir Leopold agreed. A portable writing desk and a fresh sheet of paper were brought. In front of the entire assembly, Prudence took the pen. "The forger made 3 small errors," she said. "The cross of the T is too heavy. The final S curves inward, and the pressure on the downstroke of the Y is too light." She then wrote the first sentence of the forged letter, and then she wrote it again, and again. 10 times she filled the page with her own true script, and in every single instance, the T's were lightly crossed, the final S's curved outward, and the Y's were scored deeply into the paper. The consistency was mesmerizing. It was the irrefutable physical evidence of habit. "Furthermore," she said, setting down the pen, "the ink is wrong. The forgery is written in a pure black lamp ink.
My ink, which I purchased from Mr. Abernathy, the stationer in town, is a traditional iron gall, which fades to a distinct brownish black as it oxidizes." She held up one of her example sheets next to the forgery. The difference, once pointed out, was subtle but undeniable. A hush fell over the room. The mood had shifted dramatically. Doubt had been replaced by a dawning, thrilling sense of a mystery unfolding. Arabella Devereux was no longer smiling. But Gideon was not finished. He had saved his masterstroke for last. "Sir Leopold," he said, his voice like cracking ice, "my wife has proven she did not write this letter. I will now prove who did." He revealed the results of his own investigation. He produced a sworn affidavit from a specialist ink maker in London, attesting that he had sold a custom batch of highly stable lamp black ink to one Mr. Fletcher Devereux just 6 weeks prior. He produced a second affidavit from a renowned handwriting expert in London, who, having been provided with samples of both Prudence's and Fletcher's handwriting, stated with professional certainty that the forgery exhibited signs of being traced, and that the underlying tremor was consistent with Mr. Devereux's own hand. The crowd gasped. Fletcher Devereux leaped to his feet, his face white. "This is an outrage!
Lies and fabrications! Is it? Gideon's voice was lethal. He produced one final document. This, Sir Leopold, is a copy of a bank draft. It shows a payment of £10,000 made 2 days ago from an account controlled by Mr. Devereux into a holding company. A company whose sole director is Mr. Geoffrey Ingram. He turned his gaze upon Mrs. Ingram. Your brother-in-law, I believe. A man in dire financial straits. It seems, Mrs. Ingram, that you sold your testimony. You conspired to ruin your niece and my husband for the price of your family's debts. It was the final, fatal blow. Mrs. Ingram gave a strangled cry and fainted dead away. Fletcher Devereux, his face a mask of pure panic, made a bolt for the door. But 2 stout bailiffs, acting on a nod from Sir Leopold, blocked his path. Arabella sat frozen in her seat, her face ashen, her social ruin absolute and devastatingly public. In the ensuing chaos, Sir Leopold Yardley banged his gavel for order. When silence was restored, he looked not at Gideon, but at Prudence. His expression was one of profound respect. "Mrs. Seven," he boomed, his voice filling the hall. "It appears the county has misjudged you. On behalf of us all, I offer my sincerest apologies. Your integrity and your formidable intelligence have done this community a great service today." Prudence simply inclined her head, her composure absolute. She had not come for apologies. She had come for justice. And justice had been served, in the clear, cold light of day, for all to see. The reckoning was complete. Her vindication was absolute. The victory, however public and complete, left a bitter aftertaste. The drive back to Kestrel Chase was made in a silence heavy with exhaustion. The adrenaline of the inquiry had faded, leaving behind the hollow ache of a battle hard won. Prudence felt drained, scoured out. She had been forced to lay bare her life, her skills, her very identity in a public arena. And while she had emerged triumphant, she felt exposed and strangely fragile. That evening, the great house was quieter than ever. The staff, overjoyed and relieved, moved with a hushed reverence. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the magnitude of what their mistress had accomplished. She had not just saved herself and her husband. She had saved all of them. She had saved Kestrel Chase. Prudence, however, could not rest. The order of her world had been violently disrupted, and her instinct was to put it back together again. She found herself in the estate office, the scene of so many of her quiet battles and her recent frantic preparations.
The papers from the inquiry were in a neat stack on the desk. She began to sort them, filing the affidavits, bundling the letters, her hands moving with their usual steady competence. The familiar, methodical task was a balm to her frayed nerves. This, she understood: ledgers and documents, order from chaos. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear him enter. When Gideon spoke her name, she started, a hand flying to her chest. "Prudence." He stood in the doorway, watching her. He had shed his formal coat and waistcoat, and in his shirt sleeves he looked younger, less formidable, and deeply weary. "It is over," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She turned back to her papers, unable to meet his gaze. The intimacy of the battle they had fought together had receded, and the formal lines of their arrangement seemed to be reasserting themselves in the quiet of the house. "The arrangement we made has been fulfilled," he said, his voice flat, factual. He walked slowly into the room, stopping by the fireplace. "You have managed my household. You have brought order to this estate. And today you saved my name and my fortune. Your side of the contract has been met and exceeded beyond any reasonable measure." Prudence's hands stilled on the papers. A cold dread, sharper and more painful than anything she had felt during the inquiry, began to creep over her. The contract was fulfilled. The job was done. Was this, then, a dismissal? Was he releasing her from the arrangement? The thought of returning to Marley, of having to find a new life, a new purpose, was suddenly unbearable. Kestrel Chase, the cold stone house she had come to as a stranger, had somehow, without her noticing, become her home. "When I came to your aunt's house," he continued, his back still to her, his voice low and strained, as if the words were being pulled from him, "I proposed this arrangement. I told you it was a business transaction. I required competence and honesty. These were the only qualities I believed I could trust." He turned from the fireplace to face her. The look on his face was one she had never seen before. The cool, guarded mask was gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. "I was wrong," he said. "Or, not wrong, but incomplete. I have seen your competence, and it has breathed life back into these dead rooms. I have seen your honesty, and it has been a shield that has saved me from utter ruin. But I have seen more than that. I have seen your kindness to a sick housemaid. I have seen your quiet patience with a stubborn old woman like Mrs. Kemble. I have seen you take the broken, neglected things of this house and mend them, when anyone else would have thrown them away." He took a step towards her, then another. He was closing the space between them, the formal distance their arrangement had always required. "These are not terms one puts in a contract, Prudence." He said her name again, and the sound of it in the quiet room was a revelation. It was not the crisp, formal Mrs. Severn of their public lives, nor the clipped Miss Bellamy of their first encounter. It was her name, spoken with a warmth and intimacy that made her breath catch. "This marriage began as an arrangement," he went on, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "A partnership of convenience. I built walls around myself, and I expected you to live outside them. But you did not. You walked into this cold, empty house, and you made it a home. You walked into my cold, empty life, and you have become the center of it. And I find I cannot arrange for you to leave." He was standing before her now, so close she could see the flicker of the lamplight reflected in his pale eyes. And then, to her utter astonishment, this proud, powerful, immovable man sank to one knee before her. He did not do it with theatrical flourish. He did it as if the sheer weight of his emotion, held in check for so long, had finally brought him to his knees. "Gideon," she breathed, her heart pounding. "My marriage to you was a business transaction," he said, his gaze locked on hers, fierce and unwavering. "I am now asking if it can be a marriage. I am asking you to stay, not as the manager of my estate, not as the mistress of Kestrel Chase, but as my wife, in every sense of the word that matters, as my partner, my confidant, my everything."
He was not commanding. He was not rescuing. He was not even proposing. He was pleading. He was giving her the choice she had never had in her life. I am asking you to choose, Prudence. To choose to stay with me. She looked down at him, at this formidable man laid low not by his enemies, but by a feeling he could no longer name or contain. She thought of her life before him, a life of being used, of being invisible, a life meticulously recorded in a ledger of sorrows. She thought of the cold woman who had walked into this house and the person she was becoming. She had come here seeking refuge and a purpose. She had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a place where she was not just valued, but seen, cherished. A slow, radiant smile, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy that he had never seen before, spread across her face. The last of the ice around her own heart melted away. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it gently against his cheek. The skin was rough, real. "Gideon," she said, and her own voice was thick with unshed tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. "All my life, I have been arranging things. Accounts, households, my own survival. I believe I have been arranging my life to arrive at this very moment." She knelt down on the floor before him, so they were face to face, equals in this new, uncharted territory. "You ask me to choose," she whispered. "I choose you. I choose this. Yes." She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was not part of any contract, a kiss that sealed not an arrangement, but a beginning. "Plainly," she added against his mouth, using a word that had become their own private language. "Yes." 1 year later, the gardens of Kestrel Chase were a riot of color and scent. The overgrown wilderness had been tamed into a breathtaking tapestry of blooming roses, fragrant lavender, and meticulously tended vegetable beds. The transformation of the garden mirrored the transformation of the house and of its inhabitants. Prudence sat on a newly installed stone bench under the shade of an ancient copper beech, a book open but unread in her lap. She was watching Gideon, who was crouched down, examining the buds on a new strain of apple tree they had planted together. The harsh, severe lines of his face had softened over the past year. He laughed more often, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the last of the grief from the old stone walls of the house. He looked up and caught her watching him, and the smile he gave her was one of pure, uncomplicated happiness. It was a smile she now saw every day, and it never failed to make her heart feel full to bursting. A dry cough interrupted her reverie. "If you two are quite finished making cow's eyes at each other, some of us are attempting to enjoy the scenery without recourse to a tonic for an unsettled stomach." Lady Sinclair, the sharp-tongued dowager who had become Prudence's unlikely friend and confidant after the inquiry, lowered her teacup with a clatter. She had become a frequent visitor to Kestrel Chase, her initial skepticism having transformed into a fierce, protective loyalty towards its mistress. "I was merely admiring my husband's horticultural skills, Lady Sinclair," Prudence replied, a playful blush rising on her cheeks. "Humph," the old woman snorted, but her eyes were twinkling. "I have seen many things in my 70 years. I have seen fools made rich and wise men made poor. But I must confess, I have never seen a business arrangement flourish quite so extravagantly." Gideon walked over, wiping the dirt from his hands. He leaned down and kissed the top of Prudence's head. "That is because my wife is an expert in managing valuable assets, Lady Sinclair. And this," he said, his hand coming to rest on Prudence's shoulder, is the most valuable asset I possess." "Well, see that you continue to appreciate its value, young man," Lady Sinclair said, though her tone was warm. "A woman like this does not come along twice in a lifetime." Later that evening, after their guest had departed, Prudence and Gideon sat together in the library. A warm fire crackled in the hearth, a stark contrast to the cold, empty grate Prudence had first seen. The room was filled with the scent of old leather and beeswax, a comfortable, lived-in smell. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the quiet hum of a happy, well-run home. Gideon handed her a small, beautifully wrapped package. "I have a gift for you," he said. Inside, Prudence found a small book, bound in soft, dark blue leather. It was a ledger. For a fraction of a second, her heart clenched, a phantom memory of her old, secret book of sorrows. But this one was different. The pages were of the finest quality paper, creamy and smooth. She opened it. On the first page, in Gideon's strong, clear hand, was an inscription: "The accounts of a happy life." And beneath it, the first entry: "Item, 1 wife. Value, priceless." Prudence looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. She traced the words with her finger. The ledger, the object that had once been the symbol of her oppression, the meticulous record of her diminishment, had been transformed. It was now a testament to her worth, a symbol of a love that was beyond all accounting. She thought of the woman she had been, the woman who believed that competence was the only comfort she could afford. That woman would not recognize the person she was now, a woman who knew the profound and immeasurable value of being loved. She closed the book gently and set it on the table. She stood up and walked into his arms, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Outside, the sun was setting over the restored gardens of Kestrel Chase, bathing the old stone in a warm, golden light. "The arrangement," she whispered into his shirt, a smile in her voice. "I believe the contract has been satisfactorily concluded." He tightened his arms around her, his lips in her hair. "No, my love," he murmured. "It has only just begun."